If you are confused, it's practicing safe sex SECTS, not SEX. We are here with academic researcher, cognitive scientist, and computer programmer Dr. Justin Lane. I'm Brian Switchko, and we are pontificating about Roe v. Wade v. Data. And Elise, since you were the one who gave us the not shitty title of the stream, would you like to introduce the question that inspired it?
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been here hanging out with y'all, having these chats. I'm so happy to be back after having a baby myself and going through the process. Yeah, Justin, I don't know. I didn't even announce to y'all that I was pregnant. Yay,
Congrats.
patriarchy, oppressing my joy and sharing my pregnancy with people. But um, uh, with the overturn of Roe versus Wade, I have been hearing a lot of people talking about data being used against people, period tracking apps, as well as like location tracking apps that people can easily buy that data, including the states that are trying to criminalize abortion. So yeah, there's just a lot of fear and discussion going on, and I thought this would be kind of a cool forum with the experts to discuss and give people ideas of a resolution of how we can build more safety around our data in regards to this topic.
Definitely. Congratulations too. I'm glad you're back. We've
Thank
missed
you,
you.
Justin. Yeah, thank you.
Um yeah, it's kind of interesting, I guess, to build off of that for a second. A lot of people I was kind of surprised to see how many people started talking about the data issues after this happened. Um I assumed in my mind that if the courts ruled on abortion in the way that the earlier leak was going to suggest they would, that it would go like, you know, decision happens, protests happen, massive things happening in the streets, and actual activation for legislators in DC and elsewhere. Um, and the latter half of that just hasn't seemed to have happened. I mean, not to the scale that I assumed it would. I thought there would be a lot more like social momentum about this um, than there seems to be. Um, but one of the things that really surprised me as well, that I just did not see coming, was how many people have been talking about data rights and the data that's being sold about people who are visiting Planned Parenthood or visiting um, abortion clinics or other health clinics and things like that. And I think that's a great discussion. Whether the fact that this was the impetus for it, as confusing as that is to me, it's kind of like, I guess we'll take a small win when we can get it, to have this conversation around data rights and just the sketchy stuff that literally almost anyone can do with your data at this point. Um, and so there were a couple of headlines on pretty big websites too, like CNBC even launched a thing uh, that said fairly not that long ago, actually. It was actually before the ruling came out, though, that SafeGraph, which is a location data broker, that they were going to stop selling information on visits to abortion providers, which I think was the first thing for a lot of people to go, wait, you can buy information about people who visit abortion providers? A lot of people, I guess, just never assumed that that could be bought. Um, which, now that people are thinking about it, what else could they be thinking of? Um, I know, Elise, you mentioned period tracking apps, for example, are things where that data is brokered online and things, um, and it raises the question, right? Like, what can we do, um, just generally about these kinds of issues? And on the one hand, there's your usual sort of data protection things that you can try and do, and then on the other hand, um, there's kind of more fun things that you can do with this in a way to protect this kind of data. One of the common ways of hiding your identity online is by using like VPNs or Tor browser, which doesn't stop people from getting your IP. It just throws so much noise in the system, right, that it messes up the data that people are trying to use to track you. And a friend of mine, an internet friend of mine, they were a real life friend, but I haven't seen them in like 15 years, so I don't know if that still counts as a real life friend anymore. However, they mentioned that there should be a campaign to get guys to use period tracking apps for whatever they think that app would be used for, just to see, like, just to throw off the data. And part of me, I loved the idea because, one, it's brilliant and it would work, and it's also hilarious because I was like, what would I use that app for? Like, what would I track? And then I was thinking, I was like, oh, I've got all sorts of stuff I could probably track with that. I just never thought about it, but the data structure is exactly the same. But it could mess up a lot of the data sales in those apps. It would kind of throw so much noise in the signal if people started using it for unintended uses, that it could basically kind of, in theory, it could throw a huge wrench in the plan of those users.
How many
I love
men
that.
do you think would have to use it?
I mean,
How many?
wouldn't it have to be
Well,
equivalent?
it depends on how many. Not necessarily. I mean, you can throw off some data pretty clearly. I mean, it depends on like what kind of data it is. Like, are they selling the data? What kind of data they're selling, even from the app? Because when it comes to like location data, you can spoof that easily enough as it is, anyways. But if it's just like use data, they're trying to figure out when periods are, and guys would just have so much noise in there. It almost makes you think they would have to spend a lot of money to clean that data, and they probably could, because figuring out someone's gender based on their phone usage is like shoot fish in a barrel. Somewhere you logged in and told someone your gender, and they will find it.
But isn't the issue that so the period tracking data is so first of all, shout out to John Oliver's piece on data brokers, because that was fantastic.
Yeah,
if you're
I love
uninformed
that.
about how data is sold.
I started following him because of that.
Anyway,
it was so good.
he's good. So the period tracking data is kind of like the leading signal, because then if you buy data that shows that a woman is having her period and then basically is late, so then presumably she is pregnant and then doesn't give birth to a baby, then you, in a state that doesn't allow it, can say like she had an abortion, theoretically. But is that how they're thinking of using that data to like persecute people, or is it like it was reported by something or someone, and then they basically get a warrant to prove because the other argument that I heard was that basically, like, people who suspect it can now subpoena this data in various forms, and at that point it doesn't seem that it matters that the data is being dirtied intentionally by people trying to help disguise it, because it's just specifically subpoenaing one record.
So the extent to which it's been used in prosecution, or it's being seeked for prosecution, it's a fear, but it's not something that, to my knowledge, has become actual like practice in the courts. However, because there is a practice though of the government buying your personal data, and that there is precedent that could be admissible in court, the legal structure is there for them to do that. So just because they haven't done it doesn't mean they can't do it, right? So in my opinion, that worry is a founded worry. There is reason for that worry, I think. Where you're shielded is that it's not clear that data will be used in a lot of the ways that people are saying it is, in regards to if you're in a state that does not allow for abortions under your circumstance, and you travel to a state that does, and you have the abortion performed legally in that state, and then you return to your state, that you could then be prosecuted. And that's what people are saying is going to happen. Now, that it's not clear actually that legally can happen. Part of that being that, that's something that happened legally in another state. That would be like somebody being like in I don't know, in like South Carolina, right? You go and you smoked weed in California, and then you get back to South Carolina, like, we know you smoked that weed in California. It's like, yeah, well, it's legal to do that there. And even for people who are in like there's not even a really a clear precedent at the federal level that that's something that they would prosecute, even if they could. So it doesn't mean that the threat's not there and that the threat's not something that should be dealt with like 100% just burn this whole thing to the ground kind of way. But a lot of, just to kind of clarify that some of the things that I've seen online of people being worried about that, there's not very clear precedent for it. However, there is likelihood that the government will have your data, and what they do with that data, you can only get as far as you can trust them. And how far do you trust the government these days is, I think, is a really good question. To understand, what you think the worst case scenario might be, for the fact that people were selling this data and are still selling this data. What are they going to do with it?
Can we table briefly to one of the things people were discussing about location data tracking in the context of Google? So
you were talking
Sure.
about how Google is immediately wiping all records of all visits to abortion clinics, so that if they were to be subpoenaed, the data doesn't exist.
yeah, so they said they were going to do this, but
Uh,
when you dig into the fine print, they're not going to automatically delete those search requests or that data. The users are going to have to request it to be deleted. And then also, you could say that the sudden gap in location data could be used as evidence in court. And
Yeah.
then also, how accurately are they going to be able to identify, oh, they went here versus there?
mm,
Um, so
I mean, I wouldn't be worried about that. They're pretty accurate in identifying that you went there instead of here. I mean, the not good triangulation on data, right, is when it doesn't really come straight off of like the higher end stuff. It's just triangulating you based on towers and stuff like that. But like if you hit a nearby Wi-Fi and you're jumping off of towers and they've got clear 4G, then they're going to have a really good estimate of where you are. I mean, the big data streams, for example, that we deal with on Culture Pulse, we don't do anything with user tracking PII location data. Um, we have access to it. We do have some of that, but we don't currently process it or do anything with it. We bought it directly from individuals in a study that gave it to us so that we could experiment with it. Um, but that data from Google, so we've seen what that looks like at Google. It's good. Like you would know. And if you're looking at someone's entire like Google Maps stream, right? Because when you do your Google Maps, it doesn't just track where you are, it tracks like where you were going. So if you put that abortion clinic into your Google Maps, right, that means that that data still exists in Google search, it still exists in Google Maps. Even though they wiped the location data, you still have all of this history inside of Google's data that's not just your location, but it's also your search history that suggested that you were looking for this as well. If you have Facebook running, for example, and Facebook is pinging location off of you, you can get, you can look at it that way. If you visit certain websites and that website has a location feature and that location feature is on your phone, they'll get you that way as well. So, I mean, Google, I think they should do more of like a proton mail approach to people's data. I think all the big tech companies should just say, look, you need to have a public warrant if you want this data. These back end warrants of like, we'll file 80,000 some warrants a year on people, and you can't even tell them that we're giving warrants for their data, and nothing ends up happening with it. That's got to stop, I think, because it basically has the government complicit in the PII data brokerage, that dark market that exists, and they become a key actor and a key beneficiary of that data in a way that is not very clear, that it's not tipping the scales of justice, which is one of the key functions of government. That has secondary effects of decreasing trust in the institutions, and when you have that, then it doesn't even matter if you have the institution because people don't trust it. So it's kind of eating itself from the inside out, where the easy solution is we're just not going to give that data, and we're not going to give ourselves the ability to give that data.
So let's say I'm somebody who wants to go to an abortion clinic. Can I request my entire Google data file, not just the Google Maps search, but also the other search data, and just say, hey, can I delete all identifiable data that Google has on me? And can I delete all the data Facebook has on me when they were pinging my location data? Like, how do I protect myself if I'm in their shoes?
So you can ask these companies to delete your data, and they will delete as much data as well. They're going to save as much data as they can, and they will delete some of the data. You can ask them to delete data within specific time frames, but a lot of times you have to go through their like portals to delete the data. And in some companies that's very difficult. In others it's a lot easier. In Facebook, it's actually they've made it easy enough on Facebook for you to download your data, but to fully delete your data, that they kind of say, oh well, so many users come back to the platform that we wait. We're not going to delete your data immediately. So if you close your account, they don't delete your data. They wait for you to come back, because it was something like 60% of all deleted accounts were reactivated within like 2 months or something. So they don't do a very good job of completely deleting that data. Your best bet really is to be proactive before you even need to delete your data. Turning off location on your phone unless you absolutely need it. Doing things like making sure you have a VPN on at all times. So when you do visit that website and that website is getting IP based location, right, and you come through a Wi Fi at a Starbucks next to an abortion clinic, it's going to look like you're in Romania, or it's going to make it look like you're in Canada, or on the east coast of the US or the west coast of the US. It'll start randomizing where you're coming through. Some people, they may want to try and run everything through a Tor browser, which is a little bit much, and there's certain ways that they can still track you based on, logging into the account itself. But I think VPNs are a good bare minimum, so that the IP is not consistently tracked, because they can use your IP address, right? That unique multi-digit code that every internet connection has that locates you. When you use a VPN, it basically masks that. It gives you a fake one that you share with millions of other people, and it muddies that. It makes it look like it wasn't you that went to those websites. It looks like it was just a random server in Kansas or something like that went to those websites. So being more proactive on those things, I think, can really help with a lot of people. Sadly, though, right, that's the thing you have to pay for, right? So these people, you have to assume that these people have like the extra money to just pay for that VPN service to protect themselves, when in fact it seems like something that's such an important aspect of everyday life that it should just have a certain default protection. I think that we need to start treating data like a personal possession, and that therefore it should be wrapped into the personal possession and the property protections that the United States legal system already grants you about your house or your car or anything
Mm.
else. And to say, look, if you steal that data from somebody, with that is to say you took that data from them without their consent, then you're basically looking at identity theft, or some other similar charge to that. If you're selling third party data, that also becomes an issue of data theft, unless you can show a chain of custody where somebody signed that said, I, guy or lady whose data it is, person whose data this comes from, hereby declare that I consent to you using my data for analysis. That's what I think is needed for there. And then that person can enter into a direct agreement. Maybe they are paid directly for that data. And that way they know that their data has been sold. They're the beneficiary of the data. And that company knows what they can and cannot do with that data, because they have an agreement with that person, a contractual agreement with that person that could be enforceable.
So wouldn't that fall under the auspices? Maybe that's not the right word. Under the stipulations of the user agreement that everybody says, "Oh, I agree when I'm going on to use this platform that I agree to your privacy policy and yada yada." Would that not
I mean,
constitute?
that's what they're going to try and argue. Yeah. But the issue is that you can't sign away your rights, right? Like you cannot actually contractually make yourself a slave, right? That's just not, you cannot give your rights away in that way. So if you enthrone these as data rights, if you write a contract that goes against constitutional law, right, or it goes against actual like federal precedent, it doesn't matter what that contract says. You did not have the right to give that right away or manipulate that right, because that was enthroned at something that's like at that constitutional level. So I would love to see data protections built in as a constitutional amendment, which
Well,
ultimately, tying it back to Roe v. Wade, is the only way that we would get back to
yeah.
where we were before at this point too. Is it has to be a constitutional amendment, and it's. I mean, I know it's pedantic in a sense, but at the same time, all legal stuff is pedantic. I've I've been very worried that so many people, right? this ruling was sort of like tectonic in the United States. It took so many decades of just assumed precedent and got rid of it, and now all of these laws go back to the state on like probably the number one most contentious issue in the United States, maybe number two. It might be tied. Let me put it that way. It might be tied with gun rights, but it's at least number one, maybe tied for number one with these issues. So it's a huge issue, and that it went down and kind of is existent in this way, the way that people have been talking about it kind of worries me, because everyone says, oh, they keep getting rid of like the constitutional right to an abortion. And the issue is that that was the problem with Roe v. Wade to begin with, that even Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that was her issue with Roe v. Wade, is that there isn't a constitutional right, and that there needs to be a constitutional protection for there to be a constitutional right. And I get worried that a lot of people are saying, oh, it got rid of the constitutional right to do this. Like, no, it didn't. And if we need to solve this issue, which I think we do as a country, then we have to be able to talk about, like, look, this is what it is. The issue was, this was not a part of healthcare that was ever enthroned in the Constitution, right? There isn't really nothing about healthcare in the Constitution at all. It's always been part of the state's issues. And that's one of those things where I think, like, if we have to solve it, we have to solve it, but we have to do it. There has to be some sort of constitutional amendment to actually push that and make that happen, not just manipulate something like the Commerce Clause in order to do that, right? Like, that's the same way that the federal government says it has the power to regulate marijuana. They used the Commerce Clause for this. It's the kind of catch-all BS, and that's what they could arguably try and do as in an abortion ruling, but that's still, it's just so weak. Legally speaking, it would just be much better to just say, look, no, we put this on the books. I mean, hell, if they banned alcohol.
I'm a big fan of the bit from was it not John Adams, but Thomas Jefferson, who talked about how every democracy needs to be completely dismantled and redone every 17 years.
I think it was 19, but yeah.
That's right, 19.
Every 19 years, yeah, you need to completely throw away your constitution and rebuild it. I love it, and I even love the logic he put into that. It tickles me. But no, there's something to that, and I think that, I do like that the American Constitution has the theoretical ability to change. What I don't like is that the current system doesn't have the ability for us to change the legislators. If we have the ability to change the legislators, we could change the Constitution. But at the moment, you have 90-some% incumbency rates in the legislature. Once you're there, you're enthroned for life, and then once you're out, you end up being a lobbyist, and you end up doing whatever the hell you were doing before, just now you make more money doing it for a law firm. And I think it's just really detrimental to democracy that these people become career politicians. One of the things that I liked about, again, back to like Jefferson and some of the founding documents, like the letters that people were writing, was the idea that there shouldn't be professional politicians. There should, it's one thing to have a certain professional, like a political sort of class, but to have a professional group of politicians becomes really problematic, because they never have to go back and face the rules that they've created in the economy. They never really have to become beholden to the same laws that they make everybody else deal with. And a lot of them, if they're professional politicians, they just spend all their time in DC. They rarely go back, only to fundraise back to their home states, and they become detached from the communities that they're supposed to be representing. And I think it's really problematic. I think it'd be much nicer if we put term limits on absolutely everyone in the government, not just in their current position, but say, look, you cannot serve in government for longer than 20 years. And allow them to kind of move on with their lives after they get their 20 years max, and, go back to being a farmer or a doctor. And if that's too difficult, then perhaps there needs to be changes made in the government, and that would incentivize you to not do anything too stupid, because when you get out, you need to have a job.
This is the longest period of time that the Constitution has gone without an amendment since it was written.
Is that so? I didn't realize that. How long has it been?
1992 was the last time we had any kind of amendment. I think it was in 92. I did
And
the
so wait,
math.
so it's
I'm
been
like, yeah, that's a long time, like we
that is
haven't
a
had
long time.
we haven't had any changes. And at this point, it's almost like we need a whole new slate. We need a whole, because like there's two ways to amend. One is through the voting process, which is always how we've done it, and the other way is through a convention. And I don't
That's what I
know.
think we need.
Yeah, that would be so cool if we had a whole convention, but to make that happen right now, I mean, y'all had a talk on the Civil War a couple of gatherings ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a while back.
I tried to catch it on LinkedIn, but the audio was actually kind of hard to catch when I was
Oh.
trying to listen in on that. I would have loved to have been listening on that conversation, because it's like it's at that point, and I'm hearing a lot of people say that we're already in the thick of it. It's already happening. So I mean, we are going to see
Yeah.
some big drastic change, one way or another.
25% of the American population say that it would be justified to take up arms at this point.
Wow.
A lot. There's a lot of people. And one of the things that we mentioned in that live stream on Civil War is that we've been doing this project in Northern Ireland. So I'm flying there on Saturday to meet with different like paramilitary ex-combatants and NGOs that do like restorative justice between the Catholic and Protestant communities and all this. So, and, this is one of those textbook cases of civil war was Northern Ireland, and throughout the troubles of Northern Ireland, as they call them, there was less than 4,000 people that were murdered, and there were probably about 40,000 people, less than 40,000 people that were injured by bombs and stuff like that. That's like your average year in America, in like just like one or two inner cities. Like what was it? Chicago had like 1,000 murders or some absurd amount like that in like a year ago. So like what was 40 years of war in Northern Ireland is encapsulated in maybe 3 years in Chicago. And so it kind of makes you think when you compare what's going on in American cities to what's going on in other parts of the world that have been deemed wars, it looks like it is war. The question is like, there doesn't seem to be different parties. It just seems to be utter chaos. So I don't, it's definitely an interesting issue. I mean, with the abortion issue and the idea of a convention, I think that that's pretty much what's needed, because I don't think Congress has what it takes to pass anything in terms of an amendment about abortion. Definitely not, because you have to have the full majority to pass the amendment. I don't see that happening. In theory, I could see them doing something about data protection, because it seems that both sides are starting to get fed up with big tech companies in a way, because neither side is getting what they want, which is just more control over their own narratives by big tech. And I think as we start to see the rise of so many alternative platforms, that those voices are starting to come back like they were in the early blogging days, where it's just people had blogs for everything. You're starting to get that in social media sites, where now there's social media sites for everything. And I think that there's a hope, there's a chance that they might be able to pass a data provision into the Constitution. I would like to see that. And I mean, it's interesting you mentioned 1992, right, was the last time that there was a change to the Constitution. Like 92, the internet was like a legend. Like Bill Nye the Science Guy did an episode about it in like 95, and people were like, what? Al Gore had a cameo in the episode. I just watched it with my son, because we watched Bill Nye the Science Guy. But he had it was on the internet and computers, and he's like, oh, hi Bill, and he's this big, very Al Gore, 1995 Al Gore, and he's got this laptop that's awesome, because it's like that thick and like opens up like a brick, and he is like sitting there. But then you think about it, you're like, dude, that laptop was like space age in 95. Only the vice president of America could afford a laptop in 95. So, but it's so interesting to think that like 30 years ago, 1992, so like 30 years back, we have all of this technological change that's happened. The cell phone, right, which is where most of this data really comes from anyways. computer's kind of bored. Your cell phone is where they get all that good location data from anyway. The apps in those things, you can track so much. And I think that's one of the main things that's changed that could be there and could also help deal with so many subsequent issues as well. That, while the US refuses to deal with some of its other issues, at least we could feel a little bit more secure, right? I mean, I would love to see something that happens that puts data kind of protections under the Fourth Amendment of the United States.
What is the like perspective from outside of the United States? I mean, since you're living outside, like with all this going on, and are people outside of the United States also questioning their data rights, through this example?
People outside of the US have been questioning their data rights more frequently and with greater impact for a long time, actually. So this wasn't so much of an impetus. The discussion, particularly in Europe, has been going on for a long time, and it comes to a crescendo now and again when something happens. But they've been much better about data rights here generally, or at least in the fact that they want to be proactive. Sometimes they go a little too far, or they shoot across the bow of something and they don't go far enough because the policymakers don't really understand what's going on. But they're trying here. When it comes to the Roe v. Wade situation in the U.S., that I feel like a lot of people in Europe were just confused. A lot of them thought that it was settled. The media here did not report on it very accurately. Again, they're saying it was constitutionally enthroned, and they're showing videos of like people saying that is a constitutional right, and they're like, well, wait, how can they get rid of a constitutional right and all of that? And there's no one on the counterpoint saying like it was never a constitutional right. It was actually just a ruling, and there's a problem with it. It really needed to be a law so that it could have been there. And so there's not been a lot of this. There's been a lot of confusion about it. Generally, though, in Europe, abortion is not the same hot button topic, generally speaking. I mean, here in Slovakia, it very much is still a hot button topic here. It's a very conservative religious country. I mean, you see the same in Italy, right, where it's a very conservative Catholic country. Ireland just recently had its own referendum not that long ago on these issues. Generally speaking, though, people in Europe they're what I would call pro-constrained choice, right? Which is that they're pro-choice. People here do not they're uncomfortable with the idea of people like overusing it as a procedure because it's dangerous. It shouldn't be done that way. There are other more safe ways of contraceptive, so it shouldn't be overly used. And those are edge cases in my opinion, anyways. But people here are very much like, look, if it's for the health of the mother, if it's in these edge circumstances of things like rape and etc., then yeah, that counts. That's okay. That's forgivable. Even as far as the Pope, right, who has a lot of sway in European society still, the Pope offered absolution to women who had an abortion not that many years ago, and said, look, if you enter a Catholic church, you will have absolution for abortion. Basically saying, if it was there, then that's between you and God. So, and I think that that's an interesting perspective for what's otherwise a very conservative society religiously, that they're kind of taking that, but they're looking at the U.S. and they're really not sure because they thought Biden was supposed to be a break from the Trump era, and they've not seen any signals that anything is any better in America. It looks like the U.S. is much worse off from the outside. Than it was under Trump. So a lot of Europeans seem to be kind of questioning what's going on. They don't really see the US taking leadership in anything, and they see this ruling as like kind of like another crack in the glass.
So how would we end this stream?
I would end it this way. One of the things we often talk about here has to do with communities, and talking to one another, and these sorts of issues. And what we just saw with Roe v. Wade, regardless of where you stand on one's opinion on the issue, right? What we just saw was that there was a federal thing that was centralized in DC, and it got kicked back to the states. And 60% of the country is clear that they support a right to choose. And about 40%, which is higher than it was in the 80s, but only still about 40%, are what we'll call pro-life.
Mm-hmm.
Those numbers being what they are, it's forced us to return back to a more local community. The federal government, the community of America at large, no longer speaks with a single voice on this issue from any angle of the federal government. And it never really did to begin with. This was always something that was kind of still being fought at the lower levels. And now we have an opportunity, I think, to return and use this as something to say, look, this issue, but here's all of these other issues too that are coming down the pipeline. Things that have always been issues as well, like drug legalization for marijuana, for other hallucinogens, right? Like mushrooms, for example, I think need to be a discussion as well. Rights and issues in the LGBTQ community. All of these issues, I think, are issues that when they're handled directly by the community, there becomes an emergent consensus. And so much right now of the division and infighting is because we've been trying to handle this at a federal level. And we've been allowing other people who are not in our community to control too much of our own narrative. And I think that if we go back to our own local communities, we start to retake our narrative, we start to take back our own conversations, and we really start to live inside of our communities rather than inside of these fictive communities that we try and make larger than our own life because we want to feel something. We want to feel like we're famous or something, these like mini Instagram celebrities, when we really need to be dealing with the people that live across the street from us and, the people at the grocery store and these people in our lives. Then I think that's going to be a much more healthy way of dealing with these issues. And we're going to start to realize what the truth of it is. The loudest voices are not always the people who represent the majority. And I think that in so many of these hot button issues, the loudest voices are amplified on social media, and it's detrimental to our understanding of the debates. And that when it comes down to it, things like these people are naturally becoming more accepting of a lot of people, right? Like the LGBTQ community is far more accepted generally by even a lot of people like in the South and in conservative areas. But you don't hear a lot about that because the most ignorant people in the South are the ones that are given the microphone. And so I think that, if we return back to those communities, we'll get a little bit of a better sense of where we are and what work needs to be done so that when there are issues like this where we go, hey, we as a people, we here are not okay with this. We need to know how to change it, and we need to argue it based on facts, and I think those facts are hidden in our actual communities.
So, be smaller.
Yeah.
Meet your neighbor.
Smaller. Meet your neighbor. Get some sugar. Can I borrow a cup of sugar? Remember that thing? People used to do that. They used to borrow sugar from people. People don't even know their neighbors.
The points that I've been hearing around this data fear with criminalization of abortion is that the real trouble is not so much going to be coming from our data or from the period tracker apps, but from your neighbors or from casual people, because their storage and sharing of your data is not protected by anything. It's not protected by HIPAA or anything like that. So, also just being cautious of how you share with others. It is important to create those communities, but then also important to know that sometimes your relationships can be weaponized against you.
Yeah. That is true too. I would love to see somebody to bring a lawsuit to a period tracking app that's selling the data, because I think that is HIPAA. That should be covered by HIPAA. And if you visit an abortion clinic, that is a health-related data point, and that data should also be covered under HIPAA as well. I would love to see somebody take that lawsuit, because I think a good lawyer could make a really good argument, actually, that if you visit an abortion clinic or any other kind of clinic, that is a health-related issue, and that data needs to be fully protected under the HIPAA regulations that currently exist. I think a good lawyer could win that case, and I would love to see. I'd donate to that. I'd put money up for that. But I think you're right, and I think, so this is kind of maybe even a fun way to end it is, do you guys know how much a week's worth of location data like that would cost you? If I wanted to buy, let's say I wanted to buy Elisa's data, a week's worth of her data from all of these apps, locations, everything she's done for the last week. Do you know how much it would cost? Like the max.
Do I want to know?
Just about $150.
Oof.
Wow.
And I could get anything. So if I suspected, I'm picking on Elise just because of the topic of the conversation, but let's say I was, I was the man, I was the evil empire, the machine against we rage, and I was like, I want to try and get that data. All I would need is her email, and I could go to a data broker and say, do you have, I would like a week's worth of location data on this person, and there are data brokers out there who would sell it for like $150, and I hit everything.
Wow.
Insanity.
That's how cheap it can be. And another thing, just because this is a public contract, so I don't mind speaking about it, and I generally like speaking about it. At Culture Pulse, we have bought data, and some of that does include location data from people. We've not found anything useful for it yet, but we do, we have it. And I paid. We have some Google data, and we have some data that they've sold from like their social media apps and stuff, where they download it and then sell it to us. And for that, we were paying them $10, basically for their data, and it was going directly to them, not to a data brokerage, but directly to the person.
Yeah.
And so when we get data, we do it differently. The contract is open, like anyone can read the contract, not just the person.
Fair trade data.
Yeah, it's like fair trade data, pretty much, exactly. That's kind of what we're going for with that. And in that case, we can pay like $10 a person for their data. So the data is surprisingly cheap and surprisingly available. And, to my knowledge, Culture Pulse is the only company that buys data with contracts that are openly available. Like, we can show you the contract, and our agreement with our data brokers and our clients is that this contract has to be open. Anyone with the link can view, sort of open as well. So it's that sort of a thing where, to our knowledge, we're the only company on earth that's doing that, to make sure that there's like a transparency check of like, yeah, there are people doing data stuff. Like we're using it basically to test our NLP systems. So it's a much more harmless thing than what we're worried about. But there are people who should be worried about that, and they should be able to check a company and say, hey, are you dealing with abortion data right now? And we need to be able to have the receipt that says, no, we're not. This is the limitations on our contract. This is what we've been doing with it. And we have the ability to do that. Google can't do that for you.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's wrap here and come up with a new topic for next week, later. Yeah, I don't know what that new topic is now, but this is a good one, because I think a lot to digest. If you haven't seen it already, watch John Oliver's piece on data brokers, and come back here an hour ago this week for another Practicing Safe Sex. Feel free to hit us
live
up
from Belfast.
Live from Belfast, and hit us up if you would like any to suggest any topics. But with that, we will stop streaming. Thank you so much, Elise, Justin, Jeremy, for joining us, and also Debs for popping in. We will see you next time.
Cheers, guys. Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.